Well, for some reaction to the ICJ ruling, we're now joined by Canada's ambassador to the UN, Bob Rae. Ambassador Rae, thank you for taking the time.
It's a pleasure, Michael. Good to talk to you.
The Prime Minister, he says that the ruling from the ICJ today essentially are binding and that Canada expects everyone to comply with them. But is that just lip service, though? Because the ICJ has really no way of enforcing this ruling.
Well, that's one of the central dilemmas of international law. It goes back a long way. It goes back several hundred years, Michael. So the enforcement mechanisms are much less clear in international law than they are if you run a red light, and that's one of the problems that we have. But the Prime Minister did make it clear that he feels he considers the decisions to be binding, and we do consider them to be binding and binding on us. We don't think we can pick and choose which things we like and which things we don't like. Fundamentally, we have to look at a court which has been established for several decades. It's been supported by countries around the world, including Russia, the United States, and other countries. And we see no reason not to indicate our strong support for the court. At the same time, we have to remember that this is not only a directive towards Israel, it's a directive towards Hamas. It says Hamas should release the hostages. We've been saying that since October the 7th. We now find out that Hamas has taken hostages, and which were not real life people, they're dead bodies. And they brought them back to Gaza, and they've kept them, pretending that they were people who could be traded for their own prisoners in Israeli jails. So, I mean, the conduct here is atrocious, and we need to understand that if there is a ceasefire negotiation, which we think there will be this weekend, we hope that it succeeds. We hope that we can avoid the level of civilian loss of life, which we've seen. But none of us should be under any illusions that this is easy. But we are supportive of what we can do, what we must do, to protect civilian life and to understand that even in the worst conflicts, there are rules.
Mm-hmm. So what can Canada do? You know, if it is binding on all, including Israel, Hamas, and on Canada, what effectively can this country do to exert pressure to make sure that this ICJ ruling is actually followed?
Well, I mean, look at what we have done. We've made it clear that we consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. We've issued sanctions against the leadership of the country and placed every form of economic and other limitation we can on their conduct. That is what we can do from this vantage point. We've also made it clear to Israel that we will not be supportive. We're not supportive of continuing carrying out a war in Gaza, which has an intolerable effect on human life, on civilian infrastructure, and that is not something we can say we're quite happy with. We're not happy with it, and we do think it poses a real problem for Israel, as much as it poses a problem for the innocent civilians who are living in Gaza. And this is not a new notion. Yes, countries can defend themselves. Yes, they have rights under international law. If your country has been invaded, you can respond. There are wars of self-defense, but even a war of self-defense has to follow the basic requirements of international law with respect to the protection of civilians.
Now, it has been suggested that Canada actually pursue an arms embargo against Israel, also impose sanctions on Israel's war cabinet. At what point would that be possible? Is that ever possible?
Well, we've already indicated, there's been a lot of talk about arms embargoes with respect to Israel. Canada is not a major military supplier to Israel at all, and we never have been. But we have made it clear that we will not be supplying weaponry that we think it's potentially going to be used in the conflict directly in Gaza. At the same time, we have said that we believe, because Israel has the right to self-defense, that if there's material that, for example, allows the Iron Dome to work, and then we're not going to withhold that from Israel. So we're trying to walk a path that we think is principled and practical. We want to maintain an open dialogue with the government of Israel about why we think it's important for certain rules to be observed and why it's in the interest of Israel to be thinking through more carefully the need for a two-state solution. Ironically, one that Mr. Netanyahu himself talked about in 2009. So we need to understand that the creation of an effective Palestinian state is in the interest of the people of Israel as much as it's in the interest of the Palestinians.
Is that even possible, though, given what we are witnessing right now, given just how violent it has become? Is a two-state solution even a real possibility?
Well, Germany and France managed to talk to each other after the Second World War. That was pretty destructive. No one should assume that war is a permanent condition of the human species. It is a terrible thing, and it's very destructive, and it has horrendous impact on people and their families and the human community. But don't say that it's impossible for countries to talk to each other when a war is over. The challenge of this war is that it is a war that it dramatically affects civilians, and that in the case of Hamas, it's a war that's being carried out by a terrorist organization, and they are deliberately going after civilians. And there's a difference between deliberately going after civilians and the fact that in a war people are killed. But the issue in this issue in Gaza is, I think the court has made its ruling. The negotiations that have been underway for a substantial period of time are all about how do we protect human life and how do we ensure that the rules of war are observed. And that's something we consistently have to do.
I wonder how you feel then, because, Israel, and I know you know this, has already rejected this ruling. Benny Gantz, a member of the Israeli War Cabinet, he said his country is essentially obliged to continue fighting. He also says that Israel will follow international law and try to avoid harming civilians. What do you make of that response then? And I hear what you're saying, that Canada is trying to walk a fine line here, but when Israel clearly says it rejects the ruling, what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is to say we all have to follow the rules. And my second reaction is to say Israel has had several discussions with Hamas in the last 4 months about a ceasefire. So, would they be entering into a ceasefire negotiation if they didn't recognize that there was a problem with the way in which the war was being conducted? They want to get the hostages out, and the court has said that to Hamas, you have to release the hostages. So there's now a negotiation going on between the parties, which will in effect, if it leads to a ceasefire, will in effect adopt the ruling of the court. So let's try to be consistent here and understand that there will have to be a ceasefire if the hostages are going to be released in the way in which this war is now structured. It's a terrible thing. But Israel would not have entered into these negotiations several times in the past 4 months and would not have actually carried out a swap of hostages for prisoners and a short ceasefire if they didn't realize that this was something that was in their interest to do as much as anyone else's. But I do think we have to be clear here about the importance of having laws and the importance of respecting laws and of understanding that the failure to live up to the law has consequences. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's not clear. The issue of enforcement of international law has bedeviled international law from the very get-go, but we need to understand that it is a form of rules-based behavior that is actually in the interest of everyone, not just in the interests of one group or another.
Ambassador Bob Rae, I always appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
And you.